What are all of the different permanency outcomes? Of course, reunification or returning the child to the parent is one of the possible permanency outcomes. Adoption, which would follow the termination of parental rights and is discussed more later in this slideshow, is another possible outcome. Permanent placement with a relative is the third. Kinship legal guardianship, which is also discussed more later, is another option. Independent living is a permanency plan for older youth in care. Long-term institutionalization for children for medical reasons are unable to be outside of an institutionalized setting. However, please note that long-term institutionalization should not be really used as a permanency plan, as is possible for these children to still be adopted or find permanency in other ways, and they should always be pursued and prioritized. We are now going to start talking more about the termination of parental rights. I want you to know that in New Jersey, on child welfare cases, the terms guardianship and termination are sometimes used interchangeably, which can be confusing. As you may remember, once a termination case is filed, these are now called FG cases as opposed to FN cases. On the dockets, the G stands for guardianship, so sometimes in court you'll hear that your case is being called a guardianship case, and that means that's the point we are now up to in these proceedings. When the permanency plan of adoption is approved, it doesn't mean that the kids will definitely be adopted. First, the division has to file the papers to terminate the parents' rights. After they're filed, the court will schedule a trial on the termination of parents' rights, and that trial can be scheduled up to 6 months after filing the paperwork. That's a long time that things can take a different turn on a case. I do want to note again, as we talked about earlier, that under federal law, the division is supposed to file to terminate parents' rights if the child has been in placement for 15 of the last 22 months. That's the timeline determined by the Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA. And we will talk a little bit more about that later because there are exceptions to that rule. As I said, the case should be tried within 6 months of the filing of the termination papers. Judges are pretty strict about not granting adjournments on these cases, and when possible, the trial dates should be held on consecutive days so that the case is not dragged out for a few weeks. Because there could be such a long delay between the filing of the papers and the trial cases, the case can take turns in the meantime. It's possible that the parent could totally turn things around in that time, and the division could withdraw the termination petition and instead change the permanency goal to reunification. One thing to keep in mind is that CASA does not participate in the termination trial. Just like with the fact-finding trial, we are not actual participants on the case, and we can choose to observe the trial if we wish, but we are not expected to provide a court report or to participate in any way in the trial. As I just mentioned, termination of the parental rights complaint can be withdrawn by the division if the circumstances in the case have changed. If it is withdrawn, then a new permanency plan will need to be put forward. Sometimes the division receives a little bit of pressure from the judge, and the judge might forecast that they don't see that the division is going to be able to meet the standards that must be met in order to prove that a parent's rights should and can be terminated, and that might also result in a withdrawal. After a termination petition is filed, there's still a lot of time before the trial. The court still needs to be involved in the case. In this time period, rather than having compliance reviews regularly, the court now has case management conferences. At these hearings, the court makes sure that everything, including discovery and evaluations, are being completed for the termination of trial. The court also continues to monitor the services that are being provided. As a CASA at these hearings, you will provide the court with a court report to update the judge as to how the child is doing and to make recommendations for anything that the child needs. Additional case management conferences may be scheduled if there's still additional time between this hearing and the termination trial. In order for a judge to actually terminate the parent's rights, the division has to prove all 4 prongs that you see on the slide. During the course of the trial, termination is required if the child's safety and welfare will continue to be endangered by the parental relationship, if the parent is unwilling or unable to eliminate harm to the child, and the division has made reasonable efforts to provide services, and the termination of parental rights will do no more harm than good. These last 2 prongs are the ones that come up most often. If the parent has been unwilling and unable to actually comply with the services that are being offered to the parent, that could be a reason why the division is now seeking to terminate the parent's rights. The division also has to be able to prove that they have made reasonable efforts to provide services, so if there has been problems in the division and they were supposed to offer therapy and they did not, or the division was not making sure that visits happened, those could be reasons why a judge might deny termination. It's a pretty hard test for the division to be able to prove all four of these prongs, and because termination is so extreme, some call it the death sentence of family law. And judges don't like to terminate a parent's rights unless they have to, because essentially then they are creating a legal orphan. Once the termination trial is over, if the judge does order the parent's rights terminated, guardianship is awarded to the division, and then the FG docket is closed and the case reverts back to an FC docket number, which will stay with this case the whole time until the kid is adopted or ages out of the system.